Let me begin this video by recognizing that the coronavirus, while a crisis, is nowhere near as lethal or as transformative as the bubonic plague or past pandemics before modern medicine. That being said, by its very nature as an infectious disease, we may be able to draw some interesting parallels. The historian Philip Ziegler wrote in his 1969 survey of the 14th century bubonic plague that modern man was forged in the crucible of the Black Death. Camille Paglia reinforced this point in her book Sexual Persona. Plague punctuates cultural change. For Paglia, plague ended the high classicism of Athenian culture, while the Black Death set the social conditions for the Renaissance to emerge from. As Paglia writes, Christianity's failure to protect the good damaged the church authority and opened the way for the Reformation. I think the grossness and squalor of plague broke the Christian taboo on display of the body. Pagan nudity reappeared in its anguished Hellenistic form of torture, massacre, and decay. By reducing persons to bodies, the plague put personality into a purely physical or secular dimension. This is the masterpiece of Laocoon from the early 1st century BCE. This is a couple centuries after the Athenian plague, but it is an example of Hellenistic art. This particular work later influenced Michelangelo in the Renaissance. I'll show a few images of Michelangelo's work so you can see the similarities. It demonstrates what Paglia is referring to when she describes the anguished Hellenistic form of torture, massacre, and decay. The 18th century German art historian Johann Winckelmann wrote of Laocoon that the pain discovers itself in every muscle and sinew of his body, and the beholder, while looking at the agonized contraction of the abdomen, without viewing the face and other parts, believes that he almost feels the pain himself. This heightened consciousness of the body has a way of reducing the individual to a universal condition of human frailty and vulnerability, and it has enormous potential to change the social relations of society. Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, written in the 14th century, describes how upper-class women infected with the plague were treated by lower-class male servants. Boccaccio writes, as a result of this wholesale desertion of the sick by neighbors, relatives, and friends, and in view of the scarcity of servants, there grew up a practice almost never previously heard of, whereby when a woman fell ill, no matter how gracious or beautiful or gently bred she might be, she raised no objections to being attended by a male servant, whether he was young or not. Nor did she have any scruples about showing him every part of her body as freely as she would have displayed it to a woman, provided that the nature of her infirmity required her to do so. And this explains why those women who recovered were possibly less chaste in the period that followed. Boccaccio goes on, a great many people died who would perhaps have survived had they received some assistance, and hence, with the lack of appropriate means for tending the sick and the virulence of the plague, the number of deaths reported in the city, whether by day or night, was so enormous that it astonished all who heard tell of it, to say nothing of the people who actually witnessed the carnage. And it was perhaps inevitable that among the citizens who survived there arose certain customs that were quite contrary to established tradition. This was written in the 14th century at the dawn of the Italian Renaissance. I read this and my mind jumps to Da Vinci and his anatomical studies. These exquisite drawings are not as artistic as much as they are scientific. If the human body is incarnated with a soul, if it is incarnated as a person, then the physical systems which govern it are inaccessible. We see the singularity of the person as an end in itself, totally irreducible and sacred in the sense that the individual point of view cannot be substituted. If, however, one sees beyond what is sacred of the human being to instead apprehend a body as merely a body, then and only then can a scientific approach towards an understanding of the human being begin. This allows us to see what is so remarkable about modern science and why it is sometimes vilified. Because in order to scientifically understand the human body, we have to first suppress all of the inclinations of our interpersonal existence. We have to see the body as a thing among other things, as opposed to an end in itself. When we encounter an individual suffering from some affliction, we have to see beyond our own empathy to also see the body as a system. Moreover, our desire to aid the sick runs counter to our best interests in a crisis of infectious disease, as the entire world is now reminded. We feel compelled to come together in close proximity with others at a time when we need to distance ourselves from each other. For a scientist to understand a virus, as opposed to assuming it to be some demon, the conception of the individual, of the person, must be suppressed so that the organism of the human being can be illuminated on the ground of the physical body. The individual becomes a collection of host cells from which the virus may propagate. This biological lens requires us to alienate ourselves from personal identity and from the interpersonal dimension of life. Now, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, so bear with me. I started the video with a quote by Philip Ziegler about modernity resulting from the Black Death, the crucible of the Black Death. And ultimately, I feel it is alienation as a result of Enlightenment thought which brings the modern world to fruition. Alienation as a symptom of modern life, as the condition of modern life, is often expressed as a bad thing. For a Marxist, alienation estranges us from the true nature of our social relations, an estrangement from the things we do for each other when we perceive the individual as an end in itself. Our estrangement from this moral imperative is what opens the door to the most awful practices of capitalism, the price gouging of pharmaceutical companies being a good example. But this estrangement is also what allows for trade and cooperation with people of different origins and customs to be conducted. It allows for a fair accounting of resources based on objective measures of exchange value provided through currency. And it spurs an innovative dynamism in its pursuit of growth. The pursuit of growth surpasses the needs of consumers, and it manifests in the market through a variety of fashionable product, luxury items, and cultural content. This cultural diversity of modern, market-based societies is provided by its liberalism, its economic liberalism, and its social liberalism. And in both cases, this is a symptom of alienation. We are separated from any one convention, separated from any one ideology. We are separated from each other by the universal commodity of money. Liberalism liberates ourselves from each other. Science and market-based economic relations are both examples of modern alienation. Both depend upon a separation from the immediacy of our face-to-face relations. This is necessary in order to take account of exchange value when engaged in market relations, or to take account of the body as biological in the physician's perception of the human being as an organism. In both cases, we see past the individual. This compartmentalization is necessary for modernity, and it is intrinsic to modernity and to Western civilization. Now, pseudoscience and mysticism exist on a blurred edge between these two domains. Bloodletting, a practice that existed in a variety of forms over thousands of years, is an interesting mediation between the superstitions of past ages and the alienated scientific approach of the modern era. The practice of bloodletting is quasi-medicinal in the sense that it takes agency over the body. It is a refusal to be completely subjected to the indifference of nature. To this end, bloodletting aimed at releasing the body of its afflictions. It conceived of elaborate techniques and developed different approaches to different ailments. Despite this, the methods of bloodletting were based on false theories about the body. Some theories were superstitious, some were based simply in false inferences and reasoning. The different methods of bloodletting over the millennia were not justified by the trial and error of rigorous scientific evaluation, but they were still based on theories of the body as a system that can be regulated. The practitioners of these methods operated on the edge of these two conceptions of being, the incarnated person and the body as organism. The body is a person, an end in itself, as well as a biological ensemble of organic systems. Doctors have to make decisions that do not take personal characteristics into account. For example, in cases where the coronavirus overwhelms healthcare workers, doctors have to decide who gets access to limited life-saving resources depending on their likelihood of survival, and so they have to make decisions on the biological side of this divide. This conflict between the body as organism and the incarnated body of which one foot always remains planted. This is the perspective of the physician, and it is this perception that we are temporarily asked to adopt in order to understand the meaning of social distancing. The compartmentalization of these two domains, the interpersonal and the biological, are gifts of modern science. They are gifts of modernity, achieved in part by the crucible of the Black Death. Now, if the Black Death spurred the social changes which led to the Renaissance, what may this crisis bring? As we have already covered, a crisis of infectious disease is an equalizer in the fact that it does not discriminate on the basis of class or nationality. And while we cannot expect past events like the Black Death to give us a crystal ball to our own future, we could at least count on a new normal being established, and we could estimate the ways in which this new normal will be different from the state of things prior to this multifaceted crisis. With time, we will retrospectively see cultural shifts occurring in the present moment from which we currently stand at the horizon of and cannot see. Art in the present seems to pose a question to us, while for posterity, art seems to answer questions about us. And by art, I do not just mean contemporary art or film, but all of it. Everything from the Sunday painter to the pop star to the individual meme. The answers will be in the art, and while we do not yet have much to draw before and after relations with, we do have the before. We have what has been made up until this point. If you were in the United States during the American Civil War, you may not have been able to conceive of a painter like Winslow Homer. But you would know that the romanticism of the Hudson River School was over, the romanticism of Emmanuel Lutz was over, and whatever is to come is going to have a renewed sobriety in our taste for refined art and other forms of cultural content. The plague that ended the high classicism of Athenian culture damaged the idealism of the human body, and it introduced a need to acknowledge a fuller sense of the frailty of human life. The Black Death of the 14th century, as we've already covered, broke the taboo of display of the body, as Pollius states. Now, in our time, we are already estranged from the classical aesthetic. It is already discredited. The 20th century decimated the authority of pre-modern culture. Nazism and Stalinism demonstrated a capability among people of being both civilized while also morally depraved. World War I, World War II undermined the classicism of pre-modern aristocratic power structures. In our time, social distancing feeds into our use of technology and social media. We are already estranged from common ideology. We are addressed as individuals by institutions and markets, and the art that is comprised within them. All of this cultural content makes its appeal to us as it surrounds us. To the extent that we are addressed through advertisements that fill our visual spaces, the forms of popular entertainment, they are particular to our demands as individual consumers, and they allow for the dissolution of our common ends, our common values, and aim instead at appealing to our impulse for gratification, for personal choice, our impulse for superficial stimulus. This diversifies our interests. It particularizes content to appeal to an endless and expanding variety of individual taste. This condition of postmodern life is to be contrasted from the conventional arts of pre-modern life, which aim to provide a sense of uniformity, a uniformity held together by architectural and artistic convention. And this uniformity provided a singular authority for social membership to be established. Athenians collectively had the high classicism as their creation, as their achievement, just as Christians of the Middle Ages had cathedrals as their centralizing achievement. The Egyptians had the pyramids. These structures have no direct utilitarian function. Their presence in society provided the same source of membership to everyone. As I've discussed in many videos on this channel, we do not have a convention from which we may consistently adhere to. We have a plurality held together by a mutual detachment from ideology and tribalism. In other words, we are the same by virtue of our alienation. Alienation protects us from tribalism because it separates us from it. It organizes human enterprise to neutralize the worst tribalist impulses. For example, the separation of powers in a representative government. It compartmentalizes the organs of society to address specific duties which oversee and overlap each other, so that no one source of power can impose its projects over citizens without first being subjected to other institutions which oversee it. In our time, the individual persona has no restrictions. It divides and ventures out into endless tributaries, dissolving into alienation. There is no need to find communion with others toward a shared end when everyone is detached from the collective end. When everyone is equally estranged from a singular ideology, then they all have something in common. They are all modern people in a state of alienation. We have taken individual expression to extremes never before reached. Our individuality has bloomed in so many directions. Our individual identity has transcended our racial identity, our gender identity, our sexual identity. We have the choice of becoming members of a seemingly endless amount of subcultures. Even members of different classes dissolve in certain enclaves of culture. People of different classes share similar tastes and styles. Posterity will look back at our time and wonder, how did people in the late 20th century and early 21st century have so many divergent beliefs, values, and tastes, while also sharing and maintaining a relatively peaceful civilization? If we think of it that way, we could see our individual expression, all the details of our cultural content, as a collective achievement of modern institutions. And perhaps posterity will look at us and our art in order to understand dimensions of themselves that would otherwise remain suppressed. But there is some time to come before we could view ourselves in this light. The differences of taste, even among members of the same social class, would be seen as astounding if we could manage to apprehend a perspective on ourselves from outside of ourselves, if we could see ourselves the way a pre-modern civilization would see people of the 21st century. We would be astounded by the plurality of culture. The ways in which this pandemic reduces each of us to our common humanity, good and bad, provides us a bridge to a perspective outside of our individuality. When we see ourselves as a collection of anybody's, we can reflect on our own individuality with a renewed clarity.